I never thought I'd have to explain to a middle-aged woman with a laminated badge that, yes, my cattle do indeed defecate, and no, there's nothing in the HOA bylaws about it. But there I was, standing in my driveway at 7 in the morning, coffee getting cold in my hand, staring at Brenda Thompson, who looked like she'd just discovered the apocalypse in my pasture. "Mr. Nelson, this is completely unacceptable," she said, waving a clipboard at me like it was a weapon. "The covenants clearly state that all properties must maintain appropriate landscaping standards. Your animals are creating unsightly conditions that affect property values throughout the entire development." I took a sip of my coffee and looked past her at my 500 acres of working ranch that had been in my family since 1947. The same land that was here decades before the Pleasant Valley Estates HOA decided to build their little suburban paradise right up against my property line. "Brenda, I've told you this before. My ranch isn't part of your HOA. Never has been, never will be." She smiled that tight little smile that meant she thought she had me cornered. "Actually, Harold, when you leased that small commercial building on Maple Street for storage 3 years ago, you became a property owner within HOA boundaries. That means all of your holdings in the vicinity fall under our jurisdiction." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. The building she was talking about was a 1,500 square foot office space I'd rented to store equipment and use as a business office. It was technically within the boundaries of the development, situated in a small commercial strip they'd built near the entrance. That's not how property law works, Brenda. That's how our bylaws work. And as of this morning, you're being fined $500 per week until you bring your ranch into compliance with our standards. That means removing the livestock, eliminating the odors, and converting the land to appropriate residential landscaping. She tore off a pink sheet from her clipboard and thrust it at me. I looked at the citation. It was Official HOA letterhead, signed by her as president and 2 other board members. The list of violations was absurd: excessive animal presence, failure to maintain grass at regulation height, inappropriate agricultural structures visible from common areas, noise violations due to roosters and cattle. You've got to be kidding me. I'm completely serious. The board voted unanimously last night. You have 7 days to begin remediation, and the fines start immediately. She turned on her heel and walked back to her pristine white SUV, leaving me standing there with a piece of paper that threatened to cost me $2,000 a month. I pulled out my phone and called my lawyer, Marcus Chen, before Brenda's car even made it out of my driveway. "Harold, it's 7:15 in the morning," Marcus answered, voice thick with sleep. "Brenda Thompson just handed me an HOA citation for my ranch, $500 a week. She claims that because I leased that office space on Maple Street, my entire property falls under their jurisdiction." There was a pause, then I heard rustling as Marcus presumably sat up in bed. "That's creative interpretation. Email me the citation and your lease agreement. I'll look at it today." I spent the rest of the morning fuming while I did my usual ranch work. My operation wasn't huge by Texas standards, but it was substantial. 200 head of cattle, chickens, 3 horses, and enough land to actually work them properly. My grandfather had built this place from nothing. My father had expanded it, and I'd modernized it with sustainable practices that had won me awards from the state agricultural department. And now, some HOA president who probably thought beef came from a grocery store was telling me to shut it down. By afternoon, Marcus called back. "Harold, we need to meet. This is more complicated than I thought." We met at his office in downtown Austin an hour later. Marcus had papers spread across his conference table, his normally calm face troubled. "The short version is that she's wrong, but she's not completely wrong," he said. "Your ranch itself is not subject to HOA rules. That's clear. However, there's an unusual clause in the Pleasant Valley Estates bylaws that I've never seen before. It states that any business operating within HOA boundaries must maintain all of its operations in compliance with community standards if those operations impact the community." That's insane. My ranch doesn't impact them at all. They're arguing that it does. Odors, noise, visual impact. And here's the problem: the clause is written broadly enough that they could argue your ranch operation impacts their community because you base your business out of that office space. Marcus slid another document across the table. "But here's what's interesting. I pulled the property records for that commercial building. You don't just lease it, Harold. You own it. I stared at him. No, I lease it from some investment company, Mountain Ridge Properties or something like that. Mountain Ridge Properties, LLC, which is a holding company owned by your father's estate trust, which you're the sole beneficiary of. You inherited that building along with everything else when your father passed. Your father's lawyer set up the lease structure for tax purposes, but you effectively own it. The pieces started clicking together in my head. So if I own the building, then you're their landlord, and I pulled the HOA lease agreement for their office space. They rent the unit right next to yours. 3-year lease signed 18 months ago with you as the property owner. Marcus actually smiled. Harold, you're the HOA's landlord and you didn't even know it. I drove back to the ranch with my mind racing. The HOA had been a nuisance since they'd built Pleasant Valley Estates 5 years ago. Constant complaints about dust, about the smell, about my tractor making noise too early in the morning. I'd ignored most of it because they had no authority over me. But now they'd escalated, and I was tired of it. That evening, I went through my father's old files in his study. He'd been meticulous about record keeping, and sure enough, I found the Mountain Ridge Properties folder. The LLC owned 4 commercial units in that strip mall, including the one I used and the one the HOA rented. My father had purchased them as an investment in 2018, right before the development went in. The HOA's lease was straightforward, 1,200 square feet of office space for $3,000 a month, with a clause about maintaining appropriate business standards and following all local ordinances. And there, in Section 7, was the language I needed. Either party may terminate this lease with 60 days written notice for any reason or immediately for cause, including harassment of other tenants or property damage. I called Marcus. Can we make the argument that they're harassing me as a tenant? You're not technically a tenant. You're the owner. But I lease my space through the same LLC structure. That makes me a tenant of my own property for tax purposes, right? There was a pause. Harold, that's actually brilliant. Yes, for tax purposes, you're structured as a tenant, and their citation directly references your business operations from that location. We can absolutely argue harassment. He laughed. You want to evict the HOA? I want them to understand that they don't run everything in this county. The next morning, I had Marcus draft a formal letter. It outlined that the HOA's actions against my ranch constituted harassment of another tenant in the building, and that their continued actions would result in immediate lease termination. We sent it certified mail. Brenda showed up at my ranch that afternoon, her face red. You can't threaten us like this. We have a lease. A lease that allows me to terminate for harassment. You want to fine me for running a legitimate agricultural operation? Go ahead, but your office space goes with it. This is extortion. No, this is property rights, something you clearly don't understand. I kept my voice level. Here's what's going to happen, Brenda. You're going to rescind that citation. You're going to put in writing that my ranch is not subject to HOA jurisdiction, and we're all going to move on with our lives. We'll sue you. Great. Please do. I'd love to have a judge explain property law to you. I stepped back toward my door. You have until Friday to respond. Otherwise, your 60-day notice starts and your office is gone. She left in a spray of gravel, and I figured that was the end of it. I was wrong. Friday came and went with no response. On Monday, I sent the formal 60-day notice of lease termination. On Tuesday, I got a call from Marcus. Harold, they filed an emergency injunction. They're arguing that terminating their lease is retaliation for them exercising their legitimate HOA authority, and they want a judge to block the eviction and force you to comply with their citations. Can they do that? They can try. We have a hearing tomorrow at 2. The Travis County Courthouse was busy on Wednesday afternoon, but we got into a small courtroom in front of Judge Patricia Mendoza, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. Brenda was there with the HOA's lawyer, a young guy named Stephen Palmer, who kept adjusting his tie nervously. He stood up and presented their case, arguing that I was abusing my position as landlord to avoid legitimate community standards. Judge Mendoza looked unimpressed. Counselor, help me understand how a working ranch that predates your community by decades is subject to HOA jurisdiction. Your Honor, the respondent operates his business from within HOA boundaries. Our bylaws clearly state, I've read your bylaws, they're creative, I'll give you that. But Mr. Nelson's ranch isn't within your boundaries. His office is, and that office is subject to normal commercial regulations. But you can't extend jurisdiction to his entire business operation just because he rents space in a building. He doesn't rent, Your Honor. He owns the building. Which makes this even simpler. He owns the building, you rent from him, and you're attempting to use HOA authority to control his separate property. That's not how this works. She turned to Marcus. Does Mr. Nelson's office space comply with all relevant zoning and business regulations? Yes. Your Honor, the space is used for equipment storage and business records. No complaints from any party until now. Judge Mendoza looked at Brenda and her lawyer. Here's my ruling. The HOA has no jurisdiction over Mr. Nelson's ranch property. Any citations issued regarding that property are void. However, Mr. Nelson, you cannot terminate the HOA's lease solely as retaliation for their citation attempt. That would be retaliatory eviction, which is illegal even in commercial contexts. I felt my stomach sink, but then the judge continued. That said, if the HOA continues to issue citations or complaints regarding property outside their jurisdiction, that does constitute harassment of another party with business interests in the building, which is grounds for lease termination under the existing agreement. So here's what's going to happen. The HOA will cease all actions regarding Mr. Nelson's ranch. Mr. Nelson will withdraw his lease termination notice, and if either party violates this order, we'll be back here for sanctions. Clear? Yes, Your Honor, we all said. I should have known it wouldn't be that simple. For 2 weeks, everything was quiet. Then I got a call from my ranch hand, Diego Martinez, who'd been with me for 15 years. Boss, you need to see this, he said. Someone cut the fence on the east property line. About 30 head of cattle got out onto the development's community park area. I drove over immediately, my truck rattling over the ranch roads. The fence line that bordered Pleasant Valley Estates had been cleanly cut with wire cutters in 3 places. My cattle, being cattle, had wandered through and were now happily grazing on the HOA's pristine common area grass. It took us 3 hours to round them up and get them back on my property. By the time we finished, Brenda was there with her phone out, taking pictures. This is a major violation, Harold. Your cattle have destroyed community property. We're filing a complaint with the county and charging you for all damages. Someone cut my fence, Brenda. This was deliberate. Oh, please. You probably did it yourself to create a problem. I called the Travis County Sheriff's Office and filed a report. Deputy Williams came out, looked at the fence, and took photos. That's definitely cut, not broken. You want to file charges? Yes, criminal mischief and trespassing. The deputy nodded. I'll write it up. You might want to put up cameras along this fence line. Already planning on it. But the damage was done. The HOA filed a formal complaint with the county about livestock escape, along with a bill for $18,000 in damages to their park. Marcus sent back a letter explaining that the fence had been criminally cut, and we weren't paying anything. Then, the health department showed up. Inspector Robert Chen was apologetic, but firm. Mr. Nelson, we received a complaint about improper waste management at your ranch. I need to do a full inspection. Who filed the complaint? He checked his paperwork. Pleasant Valley Estates HOA. Of course it was. I spent 4 hours walking my property with Inspector Chen, showing him my waste management systems, water quality controls, and environmental compliance records. At the end, he shook my head. Mr. Nelson, your operation is cleaner than most I inspect. Whoever filed this complaint either doesn't understand agricultural operations or is deliberately wasting our time. I'll note in my report that everything is in full compliance. Can you tell them that? I'll send them a copy of my report. He paused. For what it's worth, I grew up on a ranch. I know what this is. Some people move to the country and then complain that it smells like country. The complaints kept coming. The fire marshal showed up to inspect my barn for violations. The EPA came to test my water runoff. The county zoning board received an anonymous tip that I was running an illegal slaughterhouse operation, which was absurd since I didn't process my own meat. Every inspection came back clean, but each one cost me time and money. I was losing workdays dealing with bureaucrats, and my patience was wearing thin. Marcus called me 3 weeks after the court hearing. "Harold, I've been documenting everything. The HOA has filed 17 separate complaints against you with various county agencies. All have come back showing no violations. That's not normal community concern. That's a targeted harassment campaign. So what do? We go back to court. This time we show the judge the pattern of behavior and argue that they're violating her order, and then you can terminate their lease legitimately." But before we could file, something happened that changed everything. It was a Thursday morning when I got a call from Tom Anderson, who owned the feed store in town. "Harold, you need to hear this. Brenda Thompson was in here yesterday asking questions about your operation. Specifically, she wanted to know if you had permits for chemical storage. I don't store chemicals beyond basic veterinary supplies." I know that. But she was asking pointed questions, like she was looking for something specific. She also asked if I knew where your property lines were, and if any of your operation extended beyond your surveyed boundaries. A cold feeling settled in my gut. What did you tell her? Nothing, because I don't know and it's none of her business. But Harold, she had surveying equipment in her car. Professional stuff. I called my surveyor, Rita Sanchez, who'd done my property maps 3 years ago when I'd expanded one of my pastures. "Rita, I need a rush job. I need you to verify all of my property lines, especially on the east side bordering Pleasant Valley Estates. You think something's wrong? I think someone's trying to make something wrong." Rita came out that afternoon with her equipment. It took her 2 days to survey the entire eastern boundary of my property. When she came to give me her report, her expression was grim. "I'd show. Harold, your property lines are exactly where they should be, but someone has placed new survey stakes about 15 feet inside your property line in 6 locations. They're marked with official-looking tags, but they are not registered with the county, and they're definitely not accurate. Someone's trying to make it look like I'm encroaching on HOA land. That would be my guess. And if someone filed a complaint based on these false stakes, you could end up in a boundary dispute that would cost you months and thousands in legal fees to resolve, even though you'd win." I took photos of every false stake and had Rita document their positions versus the actual property line. Then I called Marcus. "This has gone past harassment," he said. "This is fraud. They're creating false evidence to support legal action against you. We need to bring this to the sheriff." Deputy Williams came back out, this time with a detective, Sarah Rodriguez. She walked the property line with us, examined the stakes, and reviewed Rita's documentation. "Mr. Nelson, these stakes are definitely fraudulent. The question is who placed them. Do you have any evidence connecting them to the HOA?" "Just the pattern of behavior. They've been trying to find anything they can use against me." "That's not enough for charges, but I can have a conversation with Ms. Thompson and let her know we're investigating. Sometimes that's enough to make people back off." It wasn't enough. 2 days later, I was served with a lawsuit. The Pleasant Valley Estates HOA was suing me for creating a private nuisance, seeking an injunction to remove all livestock from my property, and claiming damages of $200,000 for reduced property values throughout their development. Marcus read through the filing and whistled. "They're going for broke. This is a substantial legal action, Harold. Even if we win, and we will win, this is going to cost you $50,000 or more in legal fees. Can we countersue?" "Absolutely. Harassment, abusive process, fraud regarding the survey stakes. But that's more money and more time." He leaned back in his chair. "Or we take a different approach." "What approach?" "We go after their office lease legitimately, not as retaliation, but because I've been looking into Pleasant Valley Estates HOA, and there are some interesting things in their finances." He pulled out a folder. "HOAs have to file certain financial disclosures with the state. I pulled theirs. They're operating at a significant deficit. They've been covering operating expenses by raising dues and taking out loans." "What does that have to do with their lease?" "Everything, because one of their largest monthly expenses is that office rent they pay you. $3,000 a month, $36,000 a year. And according to their bylaws, they're only supposed to spend money on actual community maintenance and essential operations. An office space might not qualify as essential, especially if they're running a deficit." I began to understand. So, if we question whether their lease is an appropriate use of HOA funds, we can bring it to the attention of their members. And if enough members agree that the HOA shouldn't be spending money on fancy office space when they're raising dues, the members might vote to end the lease themselves. Marcus smiled. It's not eviction. It's the members exercising their rights to control HOA spending. How do we do that? We go to their next HOA meeting. As your HOA bylaws state, any community member can bring concerns to the board, and as a property owner within the development boundaries, you have the right to attend. The monthly HOA meeting was held on a Tuesday evening in their office, the same office they rented from me. I showed up at 7 with Marcus, and Brenda's face went pale when she saw us. "You're not a resident," she said. "You can't be here." Marcus pulled out a copy of the bylaws. Section 12, paragraph 3. Any property owner within HOA boundaries may attend monthly meetings. Harold owns a property within those boundaries. He has a right to be here. About 30 residents were scattered around the small office space. Most looked bored, like they'd rather be anywhere else. Brenda clearly wanted to refuse, but the bylaws were clear. The meeting started with routine business: approval of last month's minutes, discussion of landscaping bids, complaints about someone parking an RV on their driveway. Then, Brenda opened the floor to community concerns. Marcus stood up. "I have a concern about HOA finances, specifically the expenditure of $36,000 per year on office space when the HOA is running a significant operating deficit." You could hear the murmur run through the room. Brenda's face turned red. "Our office is essential for managing community business." "Is it? Most HOAs operate with volunteer boards using email and occasional meetings. This office represents about 15% of your annual budget. Meanwhile, according to your own financial statements, you've raised dues 20% over the last 2 years and deferred maintenance on the community pool and playground equipment." A woman in the front row spoke up. "Wait, we're paying for an office. I thought Brenda ran the HOA from her house." "We need professional space for records and meetings," Brenda said quickly. "We're having the meeting here right now, and there's barely room for everyone," a man pointed out. "And records can be digital." Marcus pressed on. "I'm not suggesting anything improper. I'm simply pointing out that in a time of budget constraints, this might be an expense worth reconsidering, especially since the HOA is engaged in expensive litigation against Mr. Nelson here, which is costing additional legal fees." "That lawsuit is necessary to protect property values," Brenda insisted. "By suing a working ranch that's been here since 1947? A ranch that brings agritourism and local business to the area?" Marcus pulled out another document. "I did some research. Properties bordering working agricultural land in Texas typically see property value increases due to the preserved open space and rural character. Your claim of damages is contradicted by actual market data." The meeting devolved into chaos as residents started demanding answers about the lawsuit, the office lease, and why their dues kept going up. Brenda tried to maintain control, but lost it as people pulled out their phones and started looking up the information Marcus had mentioned. Finally, a man in his 60s stood up. "I move that we vote to terminate the office lease and return to running the HOA through volunteer efforts. We can use the community center for quarterly meetings and handle everything else electronically." "Second," someone called out. Brenda looked panicked. "You can't just vote on that without proper notice." "Section 18, Marcus said calmly. "Any expenditure over $10,000 can be brought to a vote with a simple majority of members present. This is over $10,000 annually, and you have enough members here for a quorum." The vote was 23-7 in favor of terminating the lease. Brenda stood up, grabbing her papers. "This isn't over. The board can override this vote." "No, you can't," someone called out. "I've been reading the bylaws on my phone. The board serves at the pleasure of the members. We can override you." I watched as the first real crack appeared in Brenda's armor. She'd built her little empire on the assumption that nobody actually read the bylaws or paid attention to HOA finances. Now that people were looking, the whole structure was shaky. After the meeting, several residents came up to apologize to me. "We didn't know Brenda was harassing you like this," one woman said. "Most of us don't even come to meetings. We just pay our dues and ignore everything. That's what people like her count on, I said. The HOA formally gave notice that they'd be ending their lease in 60 days, the same notice period I'd originally tried to give them. Brenda resigned as president 2 weeks later after it came out that she'd approved the lawsuit without full board consent. The new president, a retired accountant named Michael Foster, called me to apologize. Mr. Nelson, the remaining board members reviewed everything and were dropping the lawsuit. None of this should have happened. Brenda had some kind of vendetta, and she manipulated the rest of the board by feeding us selective information. I appreciate that. We'd also like to offer compensation for your legal fees. It's not right that you had to spend money defending against our inappropriate actions. I was surprised. That's generous. It's appropriate. We're looking at about $20,000 in legal fees on our side for a lawsuit we should never have filed. We'd rather put that money toward making things right. We settled on them paying $15,000 toward my legal fees and issuing a formal written apology. The new board also sent letters to all the county agencies that had investigated me, explaining that the complaints were unfounded and apologizing for wasting government resources. I thought that was the end of it. But Brenda apparently wasn't done. 3 weeks after she resigned, I was working on fence repairs when Diego came running up. "Boss, there's smoke coming from the east pasture." We grabbed fire extinguishers from the barn and ran. A small grass fire was burning along the fence line, right where the false survey stakes had been placed. It wasn't large yet, but it was growing, and the wind was pushing it toward my property. I called 911 while Diego and I fought the flames. The volunteer fire department arrived within 15 minutes and had it out in 30. The fire chief, Tom Bradley, walked the burn line with me after. "It's not natural. See here? Multiple ignition points. Someone set this deliberately." "The wind would have pushed it right into my barn and cattle pens," I said, feeling sick. "Yeah. This wasn't just vandalism. This was arson, and it endangered livestock and structures. We're calling the sheriff and the state fire marshal." The investigation took 2 days. The fire marshal found evidence of an accelerant, probably gasoline, at 3 separate ignition points. Security cameras I'd installed after the fence-cutting incident caught something crucial: a white SUV on the access road bordering my property about 20 minutes before the fire started. The same model Brenda drove. Detective Rodriguez came to my ranch with another deputy. "Mr. Nelson, we've reviewed your footage and pulled traffic camera data from the area. Brenda Thompson's vehicle was in the vicinity at the time of the fire. We've also pulled her phone records with a warrant. She made a call to the HOA's attorney right before the fire started and another call immediately after, both from a cell tower that covers your property." "So what happens now?" "We're bringing her in for questioning. Arson is a serious felony, especially when it endangers livestock and structures." They arrested Brenda that evening. She initially denied everything, but her phone's GPS data placed her at my property line, and she'd made purchases at 2 different gas stations that day, buying a total of 3 gallons of gas when her vehicle tank was already 3/4 full, according to her car's computer system. Marcus called me after she was arraigned. "Harold, she's being charged with first-degree arson, a second-degree felony in Texas. She's also facing charges for the fence cutting and filing false reports. The DA is taking this seriously." "Why would she do this?" "She already lost. The HOA dropped everything." "Because some people can't accept losing. She built her identity around being the HOA president, controlling things. When that fell apart, she snapped." The investigation expanded as detectives looked into Brenda's activities. They discovered she'd been embezzling from the HOA, small amounts at first, but escalating to about $30,000 over 2 years. That's why the HOA was running a deficit. The fancy office wasn't just about power, it was about creating a legitimate-looking operation to hide financial irregularities. The new HOA board was horrified and cooperated fully with investigators. They hired a forensic accountant who traced the missing funds to personal credit card payments and home renovations Brenda had made. The trial took place 6 months later. I testified about the harassment campaign, the false survey stakes, and finally, the fire. The evidence was overwhelming. Security footage, phone records, financial records showing motive, and even testimony from the gas station clerks who remembered her buying gas in containers. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, guilty on all counts. Judge Mendoza, the same judge who'd handled our initial hearing, sentenced Brenda to 8 years in prison for arson, with additional time for embezzlement and making false reports. She also ordered restitution to the HOA for the embezzled funds, and to me for damages and legal fees. Ms. Thompson, Judge Mendoza said, you took a position of community trust and abused it in every possible way. You harassed a legitimate business owner, committed fraud, embezzled funds, and ultimately endangered lives and property through arson. The sentence reflects the severity and pattern of your criminal behavior. I watched as they led Brenda away in handcuffs. She looked smaller somehow, the fierce certainty that had driven her replaced by the reality of consequences. After the sentencing, Michael Foster from the HOA approached me. Mr. Nelson, I know this has been a nightmare for you. The board wants to make a gesture of goodwill. We'd like to create a conservation easement along the property line between our development and your ranch. It would protect your operation from any future development and create a permanent buffer zone. That's not necessary. It is, though. Your ranch is part of what makes this area special. A lot of our residents moved here because of the rural character, even if they didn't realize it. We want to protect that, and we want to rebuild trust with you. We worked out the details over the next month. The HOA purchased a 50-foot strip along our shared property line and placed it under a permanent conservation easement. No structures could be built there, and it had to remain in a natural state. It wasn't much land, but it was a significant buffer that ensured my operation would never face encroachment issues again. The local newspaper ran a story about the whole saga. Working Ranch Prevails Against HOA Overreach, read the headline. The article detailed how Brenda's obsession with control had led to criminal behavior, and how the community had ultimately done the right thing by correcting course. I got calls from other ranchers and farmers facing HOA pressure, asking for advice. I told them all the same thing: document everything, know your property rights, and don't be afraid to push back against overreach. But also, try to work with reasonable people. The problem wasn't the HOA itself. It was one person who'd been given too much power and no oversight. Life settled back into its normal rhythm. My cattle grazed their pastures, the chickens produced eggs, and the ranch continued the work it had done for 3/4 of a century. Pleasant Valley Estates continued as a community, but with better leadership and an appreciation for the working land around them. Some of the residents even started buying beef and eggs directly from me, creating a small farm store operation that benefited everyone. Their kids took field trips to learn about sustainable ranching. It became the relationship it should have been from the start, neighbors coexisting rather than fighting. Diego and I were mending fence one morning, almost a year after the fire, when a car pulled up. It was Jessica Chen, one of the Pleasant Valley residents who'd spoken up at that crucial meeting. Mr. Nelson, I wanted to show you something. She pulled out her phone and showed me a social media post. It was a video of cattle grazing with the sunrise behind them, clearly shot from somewhere in the development. The caption read, "Living next to a working ranch means morning views like this. And we're lucky to have neighbors like Harold Nelson who maintain the character of our area." "That's kind of you," I said. "It's just the truth. A lot of us were taking the ranch for granted. It took almost losing it to realize what we had. My kids love coming to your farm store and learning about where their food comes from." After she left, I looked out over my land. The same land my grandfather had worked, that my father had expanded, that I'd modernized. Land that had almost been destroyed by someone's need for control, but had survived because property rights matter and communities can correct themselves when they choose to. The office space I owned sat empty for a few months before I rented it to a local veterinarian who specialized in large animals. Doc Martinez became a valuable resource for all the ranchers in the area, and his presence actually increased the property value of my building. Funny how that worked out. I never forgot the lesson, though. Power without accountability is dangerous, whether it's an HOA board or anything else. And sometimes, standing up for your rights means being willing to lose something in the short term to protect what matters in the long term. My ranch continued its work, producing food, maintaining open space, and serving as a reminder that not everything needs to be controlled, managed, and sanitized. Some things should just be allowed to be what they are, whether that's cattle grazing or chickens making noise or roosters crowing at dawn. The conservation easement became a popular walking trail for Pleasant Valley residents. On any given evening, you could see families strolling along the path, watching the cattle graze on the other side of the fence. Some residents started keeping their own small chicken coops within the bounds of reasonable HOA rules that didn't overstep into actual control. The whole experience taught me something important about community. Real community isn't about everyone being the same or following arbitrary rules. It's about respecting differences, understanding that people have different ways of living, and finding ways to coexist that honor everyone's rights and needs. I kept detailed records of everything that had happened, not because I was looking for revenge or validation, but because I wanted other people in similar situations to know they weren't alone. Marcus used our case as an example in agricultural law seminars he taught, showing how important it is to understand property rights and not be intimidated by official-sounding threats that have no legal basis. The false survey stakes remained as evidence in Brenda's criminal case file, a reminder of how far someone had been willing to go to create a false narrative. The fence I'd repaired stood strong, marking the true boundary between my ranch and the development, and the scorched earth from the fire had regrown, green grass covering the scar that someone's desperation had created. Tom Anderson at the feed store started referring customers to me when they asked about dealing with HOA issues. I wasn't a lawyer and didn't pretend to be, but I could share my experience and encourage people to stand up for their rights while staying within the law. The strangest aftermath was receiving a letter from Brenda about 18 months into her sentence. It was short, written on prison stationery in careful handwriting. "Mr. Nelson, I doubt you want to hear from me, and you have every right to throw this away. I wanted you to know that I understand now how far I went beyond any reasonable bounds. I convinced myself I was protecting the community, but I was really just feeding my own need to control things. I'm getting help here, therapy mostly, trying to understand why I couldn't let go. I know an apology doesn't fix anything, but I am sorry for what I put you through. You didn't deserve any of it." I read the letter twice, then filed it away. I didn't write back. Some things don't need a response, but I appreciated that she'd at least reached a point of self-awareness, even if it came too late to undo the damage. The ranch prospered in the years that followed. I expanded the farm store into a real business, offering not just beef and eggs, but also educational tours for school groups and families. Teaching kids where their food came from became one of my favorite parts of the operation. One afternoon, I was showing a group of third graders how to collect eggs when one of them asked, "Did someone really try to burn down your ranch?" Their teacher looked mortified, but I nodded. They did. But a lot of good people made sure that didn't happen, and now we're here collecting eggs together. That's what matters. Why did they want to burn it? Because she was angry and made bad choices. But you know what? Even when bad things happen, if you have good neighbors and you stand up for what's right, things can work out okay. The kids seemed satisfied with that answer and went back to carefully placing eggs in a basket. Simple wisdom for a simple question, but it was the truth. Diego eventually became my full partner in the ranch operation. He'd been with me through everything, from rounding up escaped cattle to fighting the fire to testifying at the trial. He'd earned a stake in the place, and it was right to make it official. "You sure about this, boss?" he asked when I showed him the partnership papers. "This ranch has survived because good people have taken care of it. You're good people, Diego, and I'm not getting any younger. I want to know this place will be in good hands." We continued the work together, modernizing where it made sense, preserving what mattered, and always remembering the lessons we'd learned about standing firm against unreasonable demands while staying open to reasonable cooperation. Pleasant Valley Estates thrived too, under leadership that understood the difference between maintaining community standards and overreaching into control that didn't belong to them. Property values actually increased, probably helped by the fact that they could advertise themselves as a community that respected agricultural heritage and open spaces. The commercial building that had been at the center of everything remained quietly productive. Doc Martinez's veterinary practice grew, My equipment storage stayed organized, and the former HOA office became a small coffee shop run by a young couple who appreciated the rural setting. Sometimes I'd stop by for coffee and end up in conversations with Pleasant Valley residents about ranch life, sustainable agriculture, or just the weather. Normal neighbor conversations, the kind that should have been happening all along. The whole saga became a story told in ranching circles, a cautionary tale about HOA overreach and a success story about standing up for property rights. But for me, it was simpler than that. It was about refusing to let anyone tell me that the work my family had done for 75 years was somehow less valid than their desire for control. I kept the pink citation Brenda had handed me that morning in my office, filed next to Judge Mendoza's final order, the settlement agreement with the HOA, and the deed to the conservation easement. Documents that told the story of conflict and resolution, of overreach and correction, of near disaster and ultimate triumph. My grandfather's original land deed hung on the wall above these files, dated 1947, a reminder that this land had seen challenges before and survived them. Property rights matter because they protect not just land, but the work and heritage and purpose that land represents. The ranch continues today, a working operation producing food, providing education, and maintaining the rural character of an area that's increasingly surrounded by development. But it's protected now, both legally through the conservation easement and socially through relationships with neighbors who understand and appreciate what it represents. I never had to lock the HOA office door myself. The members did it, exercising their own rights to control their organization and redirect it toward reasonable purposes. That was more satisfying than any action I could have taken, because it meant the community had corrected itself. The lesson wasn't that HOAs are inherently bad, but that any organization without proper oversight and accountability can become a vehicle for abuse. The Pleasant Valley Estates HOA under new leadership proved that the same structure could function perfectly well when run by people who understood the limits of their authority. I still start most mornings with coffee on my porch, looking out over the same pastures my grandfather cleared and my father expanded. Cattle graze, chickens scratch in their yard, and the sun rises over land that will continue its work long after I'm gone. That's what mattered all along, not winning a fight with an HOA, but preserving the ability of this land to do what it's meant to do. The $500 a week fines never got paid, the lawsuit got dropped, and the HOA office space found a better purpose. Justice didn't come from revenge or getting even, but from the system working as it should when people stand up for their rights and communities choose accountability over enabling abuse. Looking back, I'm grateful for the support I received from Marcus, from the new HOA board, from neighbors who spoke up, and from a legal system that ultimately protected property rights over manufactured jurisdiction. But I'm most grateful that my grandfather had the foresight to establish this ranch on land he owned outright, giving future generations the foundation to resist unreasonable pressure. The ranch stands today not because I fought off an HOA, but because 3 generations built something worth protecting, and because when that protection was necessary, the tools were available to make it happen within the law. That's the real story, not conflict but continuation, not revenge but perseverance. And every time I see families walking the conservation easement trail, watching my cattle graze in the evening light, or kids at the farm store learning where eggs come from, I'm reminded that the best outcome wasn't destroying the HOA or punishing everyone involved. It was creating a situation where both the ranch and the community could thrive together, respecting boundaries while appreciating proximity. That morning when Brenda handed me that citation seems like a lifetime ago now, though it's only been a few years. The anger I felt has faded into understanding that most conflicts come from fear and insecurity rather than genuine malice. She was afraid of losing control, of being irrelevant, of not mattering. She made terrible choices because of that fear, choices that cost her freedom and caused enormous damage. But the ranch survived, the community corrected itself, and life continued in the way it should, with working land producing food and preserving open space while people live their lives nearby, respecting what came before while building what comes next. That's not just a happy ending to a conflict. It's the way things ought to be all along.